All right, everyone, we are here for yet another Wildlife for You wildlife webinar. And today is going to be a really cool class. This is a brand new class at the suggestion of one of our brighter students that said, hey, why don't you do a class on bats? And I think it was such a wonderful suggestion, not just because this topic is long overdue, but here we are nearing the end of October, so Halloween's right around the corner. So it is a very, very fitting type of presentation for you today. So with such a small class, I'm going to very, very much encourage class participation because I do have some slides where I'm going to be asking for input. So please don't be shy on any of those slides. And I might not move on until someone speaks up. So I'm putting the onus on you guys. So with that, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about bats. And I named this Going Batty for Bats. I couldn't think of a good name, so that's what you're stuck with. And so what we're going to do today before we jump in, like I always do, for those that don't know me, I know everyone in this class knows me, but if anyone ever gets this recording, we want to make sure that the people know that the information that we present on these Wildlife for You classes is coming straight from science, and they're from instructors that have quite a bit of experience and education in this particular field. So I'm Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been doing this for over 25 years. I have my degree in wildlife biology. I've worked with numerous kinds of animals, mostly large mammals. I love bear and deer and cougars and all those things. But I've had some really, really, really cool jobs, from being the big game coordinator for the state of Tennessee to the chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. Most recently, I've worked for the U.S. Forest Service in New Mexico. And currently, I'm a wildlife specialist with the Bureau of Land Management. So with many of the jobs, I've been blessed to be able to work with lots of different animals. And so I'm muting some microphones until we're ready until anyone's ready to speak. So anyway, what you're going to get tonight is definitely science-based information. So at any point throughout this presentation, if you have any questions or comments, by all means, please speak up. We want to engage the students. We want the students to learn as much as possible. And so, where'd my screen? Oop. Okay, so today, like I said, we're going to be talking about bats. And bats, they're a wonderful, wonderful animal. And I know everyone thinks they're really cute and adorable. And so we're going to spend time talking about how awesomely cute they are. But here's the thing, I laugh at this because has anyone ever gone to a chalet or their cabin or someplace in the woods or even your house, and you are sitting there reading a book, you just stoked the wood in the fireplace, and you look up and you see this thing hanging from the ceiling, and you're wondering what it is, and you're praying that it's not what you think it is. And then you realize, yes, I have a bat in the house. I don't know if you've ever done it. Has anyone ever had bats in their house?
Yes.
Okay. It is something that the thing that usually happens whenever someone sees a bat in the house, it sparks this anxiety. And usually the first thing that happens is everybody in the room goes screaming, running out of the room and closes the door. And then they huddle up and they try to figure out what they're going to do because they have a bat somewhere in the house. And generally how it happens is after you huddle up for a little bit, you draw straws to see who selected the shortest straw, or the two people that selected the shortest straw. The next thing you do is you enter the room trying to remove the bats, and you're usually dressed like this. This is a scene from a classic movie called The Great Outdoors, and that's exactly what happened. They were in their cabin. This is Dan Aykroyd and John Candy, by the way, and there was a bat in their cabin, and so they had to try to get this bat out there. And I laugh at it because I've probably been in 2 or 3 different situations where we reacted exactly like that. And just trying to figure out how to remove this tiny, tiny little creature from your house that usually completely wigs everybody out. So needless to say, people have this stigma about bats being this really ugly, like horrifying type of creature. But I will tell you what bats lack in that whole cuteness type of lovable type of feel, they absolutely more than make up for in their usefulness to not just the world, but to humans in general too. And so what I want to do, and this is where you can unmute yourself, but what are some of the benefits of bats? Can someone give me one right off the bat?
Pollination.
Okay, I'm gonna save that one because you're going out of order, Trish. Give me another one.
Sorry.
Consume insects.
Okay.
Eating,
Yes.
eating
Insect
crop,
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yes.
eating crop insects.
They eat insects, and bats are not just notorious for eating insects. They're very, very, very efficient and good at it. And one of the good things, the insects they eat is not always these larger insects like moths and grasshoppers. Believe it or not, there's some species of bats that will actually feed on mosquitoes. And like I said, they're quite good at it. The thing that is absolutely incredible, some of those bats that specialize in eating those insects, they can eat upwards of about 1,200 mosquitoes, or at least mosquito-sized insects per hour. And to think these bats are oftentimes out during the night for many hours, and sometimes there's thousands and thousands of bats out there. And so the volume of these mosquito and mosquito-sized insects that are consumed by bats is very, very significant. So without bats in the world, we would be kind of more of a plague of these insects that sometimes really, really drive us crazy. So I'm going to move on to the second thing, and Trish, I believe, already called it out because she said about pollination. And not many people think about pollination because most of the times when we're talking about pollination, we're thinking of insects. Bees are notorious for being amazing pollinators, lots of other insects. But believe it or not, there are some bats that specialize in eating nectar or pollen from certain plants. And it's kind of quite cool because they're a relatively big animal compared to, say, a bumblebee, and they will get right down in there in those plants. And so, believe it or not, in North America alone, there's about 530 different species of plants that actually rely on bats as either the sole pollination source or the primary pollination source. Now, I will tell you, most of these plants, it's a different type of plant that often, they're not the typical showy orchid type that are really delicate. It's those sturdier, sometimes more nocturnal blossoming plants that rely on the bats for pollination. But bats, without bats, there are certain plant species that would die out because they absolutely depend on bats to do most of their pollination. Okay, another benefit. Can anyone think of, well, let me put up a little picture and maybe it'll give someone a hint. Does anyone know what this is?
They drop seeds.
Well, it could be their seeds, but
It's guano.
yes, very, very much. It was kind of like a magnified picture of guano, but bats produce what every other animal produces, and that bat guano, or the bat feces, is very high in specific nutrients, phosphates, nitrates. And so bat guano is just tremendously important for literally providing nutrients for healthy plants. And so, like I said, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, it's all contained in bat guano. And some of these roost areas where you get, people don't realize the volume of bats that are out there, because during the day, those bats are typically sleeping the day away, whether or not they're tucked under the bark of trees or in someone's house, or more than likely in some type of cave situation. But at night, sometimes the emergence of these bats, you're having thousands and thousands of bats going out amongst the environment and feeding all night long, and they will be dropping some of their feces. Now, obviously, that could pile up in some of those hibernacular, those caves where they sleep. But for the most part, they do provide quite a bit of nutrients for everyday plants to grow. Another benefit, and I'm not going to quiz you here because these are some of the things I learned, which were absolutely fascinating when I was doing research for these bats. Before I move on, one of the things that I thought was so interesting regarding the fertilizer, some of those chemicals regarding the potassium and the nitrates, they're actually used to develop gunpowder. And so during the Civil War, some of these areas where the bats were roosting became very, very important places for supplies for munitions, so they can develop gunpowder to feed the troops in the Civil War. Okay, another thing, you all know about echolocation. This is how bats pretty much find their prey. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about this in a little bit. But when I was researching some of the benefits of bats, what was really interesting, you have to understand when a bat is going out there trying to locate its food, they use this kind of sonar where they emit these sounds, the sound wave goes out, it'll bounce off things in the air, whether or not it's insects flying or whatever is out there, and then it comes back and it paints a mental picture in the bat's mind where this thing is. Now it's doing it just incredibly fast, so we can actually see using this sonar. What was really interesting that I learned was the bats, they're actually pretty sensitive to air quality. So the more pollution you have, the more compounds that you have in the air, it kind of blocks their sonar to be able to find food. So the bats have to increase the frequency in which they do that in order to find their food sources. And so scientists can actually use bats to determine the quality of air, which I thought was really, really cool. I'm sure they've got other means of doing that, but the fact that bats can be an early detection system was pretty fascinating to me. And last but not least, and this is probably the most important benefit of all for bats, and especially for folks in this class, is they're darn cool animals to watch. And so I loaded this up. Just take a look at this. Just knowing what bats look like and how they act, I think they're just pretty wonderful and special animals. Okay, quick question before we move on. Was there any music playing while you were watching that video or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. I was thinking I forgot to turn the music on for that. Well, good. You got the dramatic effect. Okay, so we all know that bats have these wonderful benefits for humans in general. They're really, really cool looking animals, but these classes are meant to teach you things that you may not know. So I'm about to get technical on you. I had, just so you know, when I was putting this presentation, never mind. I had that, oh, who's the singer from Greece? The Olivia Newton-John, the Let's Get Physical. And I was singing Let's Get Technical, and I'm like, I'm not even gonna try doing that for them. All right. So one of the coolest things about bats right from the get-go, we all know they're mammals. They're not birds, they're mammals. And when it comes to mammals, they are truly unique animals simply because bats are the only mammal capable of powered flight. And so you just watched a video there that showed some amazing ambidextrous moves from the bats flying. One of the things that's really, really interesting about bats, as opposed to birds, when it comes to the power of flight, the bird more or less extends its arms, and they have these row of feathers all along the length of their arm. And that's what they do to flap up and down to give them the power of flight. What is different with bats, and you can kind of see this in the picture here, you see these bones here, those are all the fingers. So instead of flapping their arms up and down, bats more or less have these webbed fingers that are really, really long that literally create that wing surface. And so this allows them to contort and bend their wings in all different shapes, and it allows them to fly with the most amazing acrobatics you can imagine. And so you think of birds pretty much can only do forward flight. The one exception, obviously, with birds is a few of the species of, well, hummingbirds, and then a couple of other birds can actually fly backwards. But bats, with the way that their wings are shaped, they can do all sorts of maneuvers in the air because they're typically using their fingers to do the flapping. Now, I mentioned they're the only mammal that has powered flight. Well, what about this guy? It's a flying squirrel, and in its name, it even says flying. But guess what, folks? Flying squirrels don't fly, nor do sugar gliders or anything. They pretty much glide. They climb up to the top of a tree, they jump down, and they kind of float through the air, but they cannot go upwards. They just go in this direction. They go down. And so bats, having these wings, they are capable of powered flight, so they can take off and fly upwards and in all sorts of directions. So that makes them truly unique in the mammal world. Now, when it comes to bats of the world, there's two primary kinds of bats, and I'll throw some, they're not real technical terms, but they're pretty much the two groups. We have these mega bats, which are sometimes called like flying foxes, if you ever heard that term. And then the other group is called the micro bats, which are much, much smaller bats. So obviously mega and micro are pretty easy to understand. Those mega bats, just so you know, they're mostly found in Africa and Eurasia. So primarily overseas. Again, those are often called those flying foxes. Those kind of bats, for the most part, here's two technical nerdy terms. Frugivorous or nectivorous means they eat fruit or they eat nectar. So it's pretty easy to understand there. While the microbats, those smaller species of bats, those are primarily found in North America. In fact, North America pretty much just has those microbats. With those smaller bats are mostly insectivorous, but there will be some that obviously will be the bats that do go after nectar and other pollinating plants. But those are the two groups. Now, I will tell you, I have actually I took a trip long time ago, and we're in the South Pacific, and actually was sitting on the beach, and one of those flying foxes came swooping. At first, I thought it was some kind of big bird, and it came overhead and it landed in a palm tree near where I was sitting. And when it grabbed onto the palm tree upside down, the branch drooped heavily. You can tell there was a lot of weight to it. And it kind of gives you an eerie feeling looking up at this bat that is about yay big. So they truly are mega bats. We don't have those here in North America. The bats that we typically have here in North America are usually about that big, and you'll see more pictures of those. All bats, doesn't matter what kind they are, mega or micro, they belong to the order of Chiroptera. So if you remember your Linnaean nomenclature, you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, which is that fourth order, and bats all belong to this order Chiroptera. Then when you get to family and genus and species, they go all over the place. So let's go back and talk about how they hunt, because I mentioned it before with that echolocation. So literally what a bat is doing when it goes out at night to hunt, because most bats are nocturnal, they go out to hunt when the insects are most active. And the way they find those insects is they emit this high frequency signal, this sonar, and it goes out, it bounces off their intended target, or it bounces off everything in the environment, and then it comes back to them, and they interpret how close things are to them based off that returning sonar. And so they're emitting these sounds constantly as they're flying so they can detect the prey that they're after. They have become so specialized as far as detecting the prey using the sonar. It's much, much better than if they were doing it by just incredible eyesight or by hearing. So this sonar is just crazy adept at allowing them to capture insects. And to show you how good they are at capturing insects. Now remember, they're capturing these insects usually in flight. They're not like looking on the ground or looking for these insects crawling on the wall. They're usually capturing these insects in mid-flight. And so you know how erratic a moth can fly. And the fact that these mammals could then pinpoint these moths flying through the air and then capture them in mid-flight, it's pretty amazing. So I got another video for you to see these bats in action capturing insects in mid-flight. You can see they almost grab them with their wings and put them in their mouth. Some of them sometimes get away. Like that guy. So great demonstration of how acrobatic these bats are in mid-flight. So you see this super slow motion. Understand that in midair, these bats are tumbling through the air and doing all these acrobatic maneuvers to try to capture these insects. So they truly, truly are these amazing aerial acrobats. Now, I will tell you that I lost my train of thought. Man, you should never get old. Okay. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. If you listen to that, did you hear kind of like that pinging sound? I'm not sure if that was actually the bats themselves. It very well could have been, but that's typically how their calls, when they're using their sonar, that's typically how those calls go. So as you can imagine, each and every species has a different sound that they emit. And so think of it as different bird calls, very distinctive sounds for every species. And so I put up here about bat surveys. Oops. I'm sorry. I put up here about bat surveys. Now, I mentioned bats are mostly nocturnal. There's lots of different species of bats. They're flying in the middle of the night when you can't really see. And so it would be really, really hard for scientists to know what kind of bats are out there, because unless one of the ways that we used to do that to document what kind of bats were in the area is we would find these caves, which were presumed to be bat hibernacula. You could go in there, or not even hibernacula, but caves where bats were utilizing. And you can tell that there's bats in there. Obviously, you can see some of the bats, or you could find some guano. But to detect what all the different species that are using that cave, oftentimes they would set up what are called mist nets. And so they're really, really fine nets, kind of like a fishing net, that they would put over the outside of the cave. So when the bats are emerging, the netting was so fine that their sonar couldn't really detect it until the very last second. But by that time, it was too late. The bat would hit this net and then fall down. They're mostly strings, kind of. And so they would hit the strings, fall down. The biologist could then untangle them and pretty much ID the bat to see what kind of species they had. Now, as you can imagine, that is very intensive, not only just from human labor, but it's also pretty intensive for the bats themselves to be caught, manually manipulated, ID'd, and then released. And so one of the things that we do nowadays are these bat surveys in which we drive around on different routes throughout the forest, throughout the environment, and we record the sounds at night. Now, I will tell you, when bats are flying around, they oftentimes, or they usually have ultrasonic sounds that they're using for their sonar to detect the insects. And so our human ears can't hear any of this, but the recordings, the technical equipment that we have nowadays, you can record it, take that recording back to the lab, and it might sound like high-pitched squeaks and squeals, and then you can actually view the actual histogram, or if you can picture a sound wave, what it looks like, you could actually analyze that and figure out what kind of species you have flying in the area just based off these sound recordings. And so we've been doing this for a number of years, probably close to a decade now. They're called Anabat surveys. I've helped collect some of those. And so you just literally drive around, collect these recordings. You have no idea what's on there until you send them to the lab to be analyzed, and then they'll say, oh, you have Mexican free-tailed bats, you have hoary bats, you have red bats. It's pretty fascinating stuff to find out what kind of bats are in your area without having any type of hands-on capturing of the bats. So I thought that was kind of interesting stuff that not many people realize that we do as wildlife agencies, as federal agencies. We're constantly looking out for bats, and we're trying to figure out what bats are in what areas. All right. Sorry for that little delay. Okay, so I mentioned lots of different species of bats in North America. And so if you're wondering how many species, it's roughly 44 species. Most of the sites I looked at said 44 species. There's a couple of papers I looked at that said 45. I'm not going to split hairs because there's some that are found in really, really small locations. And so roughly 44 species of bats in North America. Now start studying that, because I'm going to be testing you on the genus and species of all these bats. And so no, I'm not gonna. So what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the more common species of bats that you may encounter or you may hear about. So the first bat I'm going to throw out to everyone is probably one of the most common species of bats. It is the little brown bat. And I'm not going to pronounce the genus and species. I could get a couple of them, but most of them I can't. But this is the little brown bat. It's found pretty much throughout North America. Now you see the range map there where you got the red, the blue, the yellow. They're all little brown bats. Those are just different subspecies or variations of those bats. But you can see they're pretty much found all throughout North America. And so the little brown bat is one of the most common species. So if you have a bat in your attic or somewhere, there's a really, really good chance it could be one of these little brown bats. And I'm going to emphasize the word little because I mentioned the difference between the megabats, which are about the size of a small fox, versus the microbats. All of the bats in North America are microbats. And to put it in perspective, just look at this picture. This is a person holding a bat. They're obviously doing some kind of bat survey. And so think of the knuckle of your finger, and that bat is just sitting on that knuckle. So it's only going to be about 2 or 3 inches long. A lot of people think bats are much larger animals. They appear to be larger because when you see them flying, their wings are outstretched. But the actual body of a bat tends to be very, very small. Like I said, only a couple of inches. Now, if we have a little brown bat, there's got to be a big brown bat. Now, this bat truly is found pretty much throughout all of North America. Now, it does fall into a different genus, so they're not super close to the little brown bats, but I guess scientists at the time were getting a little short on naming things. So they just said, that's a little brown one and that's a big brown one. And so you have little brown bats and big brown bats, both of which are found pretty much throughout North America. Now, the big brown bat being a bigger bat, you're looking at a bat that might be 4 inches long, maybe 5 inches long. And so again, they're not really that big of an animal, but they are definitely, when you see them, they don't look like any other animal out there that you're used to seeing. And so that's kind of why bats kind of strike this hesitation as far as people wanting to get close to them. Now, the next common species, very common species, is going to be the hoary bat. This is probably one of the most widespread species. You can see it covers pretty much all of North America. It also has a large chunk of South America knocked off. And again, the main difference between the red and the green is not the chili in New Mexico. The difference between the red and the green here is a different variety of hoary bat. So very same genus and species, but very, very widespread bat. I think this bat, a fairly large bat, 4 to 5 inches long, but I think one of the very unique and really cool characteristics is the silverish hair that it sports. And so very, I don't want to say easy bat to identify, but it's very unique in its own way. Whoops. So now, since I covered bats that are in all of North America, let's look at specific regions. So let's look at a bat that's primarily found in the eastern half of North America. And so obviously this one is called the eastern red bat. And again, I think scientists were a little sparse on coming up with really cool names because it's just an eastern red bat. So obviously the hair color on this bat is fairly reddish. So kind of cute looking bat. You can see in most of these bat pictures, whenever the bats do have their mouth open, they got little tiny canine teeth that can definitely dig into your finger if you let it. So you see this person wearing a golf glove or batting gloves. Usually that is thick enough so the bats cannot penetrate that leather glove, but you do have to be super duper careful because a bat can bite you, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the problems with a bat biting you. But anyway, eastern red bat, really easy to identify with that reddish coloration, found throughout most of eastern North America. One of my favorites, I get to throw one of my western bats that I had to deal with on the forest where I worked, and they're found throughout most of the western states. So you're looking at the Rocky Mountain Range westward, almost all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They're not right along the coastline, but they're pretty darn close. But the thing that I love about these spotted bats are the ears. Tell me those aren't the coolest looking ears. Now, I did mention, we talked quite a bit about echolocation, and they have those big ears. And oftentimes, I should have put this in a slide, I forgot, but there's usually this little organ that's within the ear. I believe it's called the tragus, that helps with the echolocation. And so sometimes when you see these bats with the big ears, you'll see some of these organs that help them with their echolocation. But anyway, spotted bat, it kind of is spotted. If you look at the whole body, if I had more pictures of it, you can see some white blotches on it. But I think the ears on this thing are just adorable. All right, now that I did the western half, we did the eastern half, we did the western half. What about a northern species? Well, let's look at the northern long-eared bat. Again, scientists were lazy with their naming, but it fits the bill because these bats are found primarily in the northern part of North America. Again, huge ear with this special organ to help them with that echolocation. The northern long-eared bat, just so you know, it's come into some trouble recently that they're actually considering listing it as a potential and threatened or endangered species, but they're still making that determination. So that covers the northern part. So what if you're in the south? And I know someone, in fact, let me go back because someone mentioned the Mexican free-tailed bats. Although it's called a Mexican free-tailed bat, they are found throughout most of the southern half of the United States. And Jan says in Texas, there's a huge population of bats under the Congress Avenue Bridge near the state capitol. I've heard about this, and it's absolutely amazing. I think you can Google videos to see the emergence of these Mexican free-tailed bats from this bridge. And it's the tens of thousands. I don't know if it goes up into the hundreds of thousands, but it's absolutely amazing to see all these bats emerging or leaving the roost all at once. And again, you have to think that's a huge biomass that is oftentimes going in search of insects and other things. And remember, again, the guano that's going to be fertilizer. So there's lots and lots of benefits from having lots of bats in the area. So that is, I think, the last, yes, that's the last of the common species. So again, there's 44 different species of bats. Those 6 or 7 or 8 that I showed, those are the most common species. So whenever you have something in your attic, it more than likely will be one of those, especially the big brown bat or the little brown bat. But if it looks really, really weird, look it up, get a good picture of it, look it up. It's absolutely fantastic to try to ID some of these bats. So I briefly mentioned about the long-eared bat, but they're still making the determination whether or not that is going to be listed. And so are there any bats that are currently threatened or endangered in North America? And sadly, there are. In fact, many people probably have heard of the Indiana bat. That was one of the first bats listed on the endangered species list. But there's also what is called a gray bat. And I have to tell you that I actually worked with gray bats when I was in Tennessee. I helped with a couple of studies that were conducted on this very, very large gray bat. I keep calling it a hibernacula. They do hibernate in this cave. But there's some caves that are just used throughout the summer too, so it's technically not a hibernacula. But I worked, got to tell you a little tangent story. When I first was working on these bat studies, the very first trip out to this cave, they told me, and again, we were starting well after dark, and they told me, they said, walk up to those rocks over there and just sit there for a moment and tell me what you feel. And so I went over there and I couldn't see much. I didn't have a flashlight or anything. It was light enough that I could see where I was walking, but I couldn't really see much around me. And you could just feel all this fluttering all around you. And I knew that there was bats flying out of this cave because I went to I went to this cave on purpose. But it was neat because none of the bats ever ran into me, but you could just feel these bats all around you. What was so cool about that event is we also brought some thermal imaging cameras with us. Those are those cameras that detect the heat. And so watching the video as I walked up and stood at the opening of this cave, you can just see hundreds and hundreds of bats just buzzing all around me. Again, there is no threat to me. They're not interested in me. They're interested in the insects. But it is kind of an eerie feeling to be in the midst of all those bats flying away. It is really, really cool. All right, sorry for the tangent. Endangered species. There's a couple of these bats that are just found in very localized areas, and that's kind of why they're on the endangered species list, because they're really threatened due to loss of habitat. And so you have the big-eared bat, the Sanborn's long-nosed bat, and then there's a Mexican long-nosed bat. Now, look at the nose on that last guy. You can tell, again, bat scientists were just straight to the point. Let's call it a long-nosed bat or a big-eared bat or a gray bat or a silver. So anyway, there unfortunately are 5 bats that are listed on the threatened and endangered species list. Now, I did say that the northern long-eared, they're considering listing that, as well as another bat called the tricolored bat. So it's a process in which there's lots of investigative happenings going on when they're trying to determine whether or not one animal should make it onto the endangered species list or not. All right, so moving on. Are there any major issues with bats? And so one of the first things, whenever you talk about bats, is lots of people immediately jump to the fact that bats can transmit rabies. And you're absolutely, they are absolutely correct. Bats do carry rabies on occasion. And so we are always, always, always instructing the public, if you ever find a bat, not to handle that bat. The reason why: rabies is a zoonosis that can be transmitted. What a zoonosis is, it's a disease that can be transmitted from an animal to a human, and that human then gets that disease. Rabies is a very concerning zoonosis because if you do not get rabies shots, if you get bit by an infected animal, then you can die. And so Department of Health, state wildlife agencies, federal agencies, they're always instructing the public, never handle a bat by yourself, because if you do get bit, you then have to worry about the possibility of contracting rabies. Now, having said that, not all bats will carry rabies. In fact, it's only a very, very small percentage. The problem is you don't know which animals are infected and which are not. Now, typically when animals get rabies, they act a little bit differently. And so we always say, whether or not it's a rabid raccoon or a rabid fox or even a rabid bat, you tend to see them out in the daylight more. Those animals typically are nocturnal. And so if you see an animal like a raccoon or a fox or even a bat out during the daytime, you tend to be a little bit more cautious, because that's not normal behavior for that animal, and that could be indicative of the signs of disease. So rabies is definitely a big thing you need to be concerned about. Now, I mentioned I did those bat studies. We have lots of biologists that are bat specialists, and yes, we have to go through a series of rabies shots in order to handle these bats. So whenever we're doing bat surveys or anything like that, all of the biologists, all the technicians had to go through their series of rabies shots just to protect themselves against rabies. So that is an issue with bats potentially getting a human sick. Now, does anyone know of an issue with bats that is solely an issue with the bats themselves? And this is where I'm going to ask people to unmute or type something in. Does anyone know what the big issue? Very good.
White nose.
Yes, white nose syndrome. And so I got to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So if you were to ever encounter a bat, and typically we don't see bats close up, but if you were to ever encounter a bat up close and it looks like it has a drug problem because they're sniffing the wrong types of materials, unfortunately, that is a sign of white nose syndrome. And what white nose syndrome is, it's this disease that just recently started affecting bats. It's only about 15 years old that we know about, and it's caused by a fungus. And I'm not going to pronounce that. We call it PD for short. I know the second Pseudogymnoascus destructans, but if you say it too many times, you always stumble over it. And so what this fungus is, what this PD is, it begins growing on the bat. Now, it does not have to have the bat in order to grow. You can actually find this fungus in caves nowadays. And then when it does eventually get onto the bat, that's when bad things happen. Because what happens is when that fungus, that white stuff that you saw, starts growing on the bat, and it continues to grow on the bat. And for certain species of bats, what it does is it continues to grow on that bat. And most bats, doesn't matter if you're in the north or in the south, lots of bats will hibernate during the winter time. I have these arguments about hibernation, and animals don't hibernate in the south because it's not cold enough. Hibernation is definitely, it's driven by a lack of food resources. And so think of the bats. What did I tell you their main food source is, especially these microbats in North America? Their main food source are insects. Do we have a lot of insects buzzing around in the wintertime? No, it's too cold. And so there's no food resources for these bats. So even in many of the southern latitudes, they still hibernate, probably for a much shorter period of time. But what happens is when these bats go into their hibernacula, whether it's a cave or an attic, wherever they're roosting for the winter, that fungus continues to grow in those cool, moist environments. And as it grows on that bat, it begins impacting the bat. And if you look at their wings, they start developing some holes in their wings. It's almost like it's eating away their flesh. But what it does, it impacts their fat reserves. And so these bats, as they're sleeping, the fungus is eating away at their fat reserves. And so what it does is they need those fat reserves to survive the wintertime. And so the bats will wake up in the wintertime during the middle of their hibernation, and they got to go out looking for food. And guess what, folks? In the middle of winter, there's not much food for them to find. And so unfortunately, a lot of these bats will die from this white nose syndrome because they don't have the fat reserves anymore to survive that winter hibernation. And so oftentimes when we go into caves conducting studies, we'll use the mist nets to capture some bats, and then we can look at their wings to see if their wings have been impacted. And sometimes you can actually do some scraping of the wing to get some of this fungus to make that positive determination whether or not there's white nose syndrome there. Now, I mentioned white nose syndrome is a relatively new disease. And so I pulled this information. There's a website called whitenosesyndrome.org. Fantastic website if you want to learn more about this disease that's impacting our North American bats. For the most part, we discovered white nose syndrome in about 2007. And if you could see the map, there's an X on a cave in that eastern part of New York. The reason it's so eerie to me, it's the cave was called Howe Caverns. As a little child, I remember going to Howe Caverns on a tour, but that is where this fungus was first detected in 2007. They started noticing some die-offs from the bats, and the common thread was they had this fungus on it. Now, one of the things they've done is they kind of traced the fungus back and found a very similar strain in Eurasia on the other side of the ocean. And somehow that fungus got transported to North America. Since that fungus or a very similar strain evolved on the other side of the ocean, the bats in that neck of the woods have evolved along with it. And so that fungus does not affect them like it's affecting the bats in North America. The North American bats have no idea how to adapt or how to overcome this fungus. So it's really, really impacting them. And so what I'm going to do, I want you to look at the map and watch the progression of where we found this fungus, this white nose syndrome, as it spreads across the United States in a mere 15 years. So get ready and watch the map. And this just goes year by year. You see it spreading down the Appalachian Mountains up into Canada. Then it starts hitting the Midwest, starting to see it all throughout the Midwest. Then around 2016 and 17, you're seeing some of these jumps to some of these Western states. And then it's just pretty much exploded all throughout North America. Now, it can be bad news for some species of bats, devastating, like thousands and thousands of bats just dying in their caves. Fortunately, there are some species of bats that have more or less, they have an immunity to it. For some reason, the fungus is not infecting them. And so there's loads and loads of research right now being conducted, trying to figure out what we can do to help bats. Now, I'm of the ilk that oftentimes I don't want to say we mess things up more, but more than likely what's going to happen is Mother Nature is going to figure out a fix for this situation before humans do. But there is definitely lots of research. They're finding out that ultraviolet rays, for example, will help destroy that fungus. And so there's a chance, like bats, for example, in the Southwest, where there's lots of ultraviolet rays due to the sunshine, the bats there might not be as impacted by white nose syndrome. I know one of the research I mentioned doing this study on the gray bats, there was the Nature Conservancy was conducting a science in which there was this big gray bat hibernacula, which is, remember, gray bats were endangered species. And if white nose syndrome got into that big hibernacula, it could wipe out all those bats. And so they were doing research trying to construct an artificial cave near their natural cave in hopes that the gray bats would start utilizing the artificial cave. And then they can periodically go and clean that cave every year to scrub it down, make sure there's no fungus growing in there. You know what they found out? And that, I don't know if it's $1 million project, but I know it costs lots and lots of money. They found out that those bats really didn't like that artificial cave. And so they turned it into more or less a research center where they're still doing lots of research on white nose syndrome. And so it is definitely an issue that is of great concern because, again, if we lose bats, there's so many benefits that we're going to lose with, obviously, the insects, the pollination, just so many facets. Just like Aldo Leopold said about every cog in the wheel is important for maintaining a natural ecosystem. Bats are one of those really, really, really important cogs in that wheel. So, all right, let me finish this out, and then I'm going to go to answering questions because I know some people have a whole bunch of questions. I've been keeping an eye, but I wanted to cruise through the presentation. So I'm going to summarize real quick. Okay, bats have lots of benefits to us. I just mentioned it again with the insect control, the pollination, just to our overall well-being as humans, not just to the benefit to the ecosystem. They are truly a unique mammal. The fact that they can fly is unique in that mammal world. They're the only ones that have that powered flight. There's also lots of species, again, about 44 species in North America. Get to know them. If you think bats are really, really cool, research some of them. Try to find out which bats are in your area, because there's some beautiful, really, really cool looking bats out there. And last but not least, white nose syndrome currently is a really big concern of ours. And so it's a huge issue for certain species of bats. And we're really trying our best to figure out what's going on with that and whether or not we can help. Now, I will say my normal photographer does not have access and can't take pictures of these bats. So I depended on lots of amazing organizations and agencies to provide many of these photos and some of the videos that you see. It's just truly fascinating what the bat world truly looks like, because with our human eyes at nighttime, we never get a chance to see any of this stuff. Now, y'all know about Wildlife for You and the podcast that we haven't done lately, but follow us on Facebook if you dare. And then mark your calendars. Our next webinar is going to be about endangered species, because I actually spent a little bit time talking about some endangered species, and I'm not sure everyone understands what the Endangered Species Act does and how it works. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of legislation. And what I want to do is explain it to you so you understand how it works and what it's meant to do and some of the pitfalls it may have. Now, I will tell you right now, I am going to be going back to Buffalo to visit my dad next week, and I don't know if I'll have the presentation in time for next week, so it might be 2 weeks from today. I got a little off kilter, but I will definitely send out the email reminder when the next webinar will be. But we're going to be talking about endangered species, and just so you know, that is a red wolf that you see there. So with that, y'all know I do lots of these classes, and I absolutely love doing these classes, because when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge often means their existence. And so I'm going to thank you, and then I'm going to ask if you have any questions, and feel free to unmute yourself while I go look back in the chat. Trish, I cannot believe you would throw rocks at bats. Now, just so you know, I'm teasing, because I used to do something similar. Like typically when you have a bat flying in your backyard, it's just going back and forth, going after those insects. And I know exactly what you're talking about, because I'd take like a little stick and you throw it up in the air, and you can just see the bat kind of outmaneuver what's in there, and knowing that it's not something to eat. But it's kind of funny that we did same things as little kids, little troublesome kids. All right, Lori says, I was looking into a trip at Mammoth Cave National Park, and there's a whole page of instructions about precautions, including you can't wear shoes that you wore into a cave in the past year. It's funny, Lori, believe it or not, this was, I'm going to be guessing, probably about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I visited Mammoth Cave with my oldest brother and his family. And that was when white nose syndrome was first happening. Now, Mammoth Cave did not have it at Mammoth Cave, but we kind of saw the writing on the wall where a few years earlier it was detected, and white nose syndrome was working its way down the Appalachian chain. And so the thing that struck me as odd was we were able to go into the cave, tour the cave, but on the way out, we had to walk through a foot wash to make sure we would wash off any fungus that might have gotten onto the bottom of our feet. I thought that was odd, because I thought they should have put the foot wash going into the cave, because at that point in time, the cave did not have it. Anyway, there was probably no preventing it. Mammoth Cave definitely has white nose syndrome now, as well as most of the caves in the east. I wish I could tell you what the outlook is for bat populations with white nose. I know it's been very detrimental in some parts of the country, where other parts of the country not so much. So it's one of those things, like I said, I think Mother Nature, it's a sit back and see how this unfolds type of thing, because I just really don't foresee us humans coming up with something to solve such a large problem. So my 2 cents, you might not like it, but that's just where I fall. Okay, is white nose transmissible from bat to bat? Yes. Now remember, it's not like a virus or a bacteria where the bat is gonna lick another bat or sneeze, but the fact that they're in close proximity, if you see where bats kind of roost in the cave, oftentimes they huddle up in these very tight-knit groups, and a lot of that is due for maintaining heat, body heat. And obviously with a fungus, think of it, you saw it looks kind of like a powdery substance. When the bats commingle and touch each other, that's where it transmits from bat to bat. The bad thing with that is you don't even have to have the bat to bat. If a bat with the fungus lands in an area and the fungus gets, say, on the side of the rock or a tree branch, wherever that bat has been, another bat can pick it up from just landing in the same area as that bat. So that's kind of one of the reasons why it's a train there's no stopping it. And so we're going to have to see what eventually is going to happen with this train. Okay, Trish asked about whether or not humans transfer this to caves. Absolutely. Does anyone know the term for people that enjoy going into caves, what they call them?
Flunkers.
Spelunkers, yes. I'm not a spelunker because I can't fit into most of the caves that those people go into. But that was a huge concern, because oftentimes these spelunkers will go from cave to cave. That's their hobby and their passion and what they enjoy doing. And when you're crawling around inside a cave, obviously you have a lot of contact with the walls, the floor, sometimes even the ceiling of these caves as you're crawling through the caves. Again, it's a fungus that is growing within the cave and on those bats. So the spelunkers, very early on, 15 years ago, when this was first being discovered, one of the first precautions they did is for spelunkers to decontaminate their gear, not just the bottoms of their boots, but also any of the jackets, the gear, the rope. They're supposed to decontaminate it if they go from one cave to the next, so the humans wouldn't be spreading that fungus around. And Trish said, shouldn't we as humans stay out of caves where bats hibernate? Yeah, in a perfect world, but humans also share this world. I'm not one of those people that if humans, I'm one of those people that humans are on this planet along with other animals, and we should learn to do things better. I don't think that we should stop doing everything we do, but we just have to do it with a mindful eye and a mindful heart. Okay, Kathy says, are the little white bones the same as the radius and ulna? Do they have wrist joints? Again, with this picture, these are more or less the finger bones, where I believe the radius and ulna would be back in here. You can almost see two bones, the radius and ulna slide over each other, and you can almost see the two bones back in here. But when you extend further out the wing, these are the actual digits of the finger. So. Okay, Jan has a good point. Says, Daryl, it might be worth mentioning histoplasmosis. Humans can acquire it from breathing bat guano. Now, the only disease I mentioned earlier on was rabies. That's one of the most significant diseases. and the fact that it can be fatal if you don't get treated. Histoplasmosis is one of many other diseases that bats can carry. Pretty much all wild animals, you've got to be very careful whenever you're handling wild animals for numerous reasons, whether or not you get bodily fluids on you or from the feces. Feces oftentimes contain lots of parasites. And so handling wild animals or any animals in general, you've got to use proper safety etiquette where you're cleaning up afterwards, you're not putting anything in your mouth, you're washing up really well after handling these animals, because there's lots of things that we can catch from these animals. And it's not like the animals are dirty, but think they're out in the environment and they can get into lots of things. I remember one of the worst cases of poison ivy I ever got. I was handling a deer. I was working a deer check station and I handled the deer, not realizing, you don't think of getting poison ivy from a deer, but you have to understand these animals oftentimes get into some crazy things. And so, yes, when it comes to your health, don't take your health for granted. And so lots of potential diseases, lots of potential parasites that you have to be mindful of. So very, very good reminder, Jan. I appreciate that. Just reading through the last of the comments. Okay, Patricia asked, is light pollution affecting bat populations? And I have not heard of anything where it is negatively impacting bats. I will tell you, when it comes to light pollution, what happens when you turn your outside light on and you leave it on for a couple of hours? Usually you have a whole host of insects that are drawn to that light. So if anything, since lights are usually a big draw for insects, I would imagine there might be there might be some benefit with lights when it comes to bats because it's concentrating their food source. And so I don't believe the light impacts their echolocation one bit. And the fact that it's more or less a feeding station with an intense light that draws in insects, it could actually serve as a benefit to the bat as far as securing a lot of food in one place. And as far as any of the Tennessee bats being pollinators, I'm sure they are. I'm not going to list or pretend that I even know which ones are the pollinators or not. And so I'll leave that up to you to investigate that. But Tennessee is absolutely, it's kind of like a bat mecca. And one of the reasons is the karst region. The karst is more or less cave type of habitat, and Tennessee is chock full of caves. And so we have Indiana bats, pretty much all sorts of bats that are found throughout the Southeast can be found in Tennessee. Okay, Jan said about a friend having a liver transplant. During the process, he encountered someone who later died from rabies. Turns out the donor was bitten by a bat prior to dying and no one was aware. That's unfortunate. But yes, it's a big concern. Rabies, it doesn't matter if it's bats, foxes, raccoons, there's lots of precautions and regulations when it comes to handling or dealing with rabies vector species. And so bats, raccoons, foxes, there's some of the highest rabies vector species. And so there's lots of precautions you need to take. So I am well over an hour. I was hoping I would make an hour, and look at that. I made an hour and 10 minutes. So anyone else have any other questions? And I will say thank you to Trish. Trish was the one that suggested I do a bat webinar. So kudos to you, Trish, and I appreciate the suggestion. I think you'll like the next webinar, whether or not it's next week or in 2 weeks, more than likely 2 weeks, but the endangered species webinar will be a brand new webinar as well. So anyway, I bid you all a good night and thank you for being interested in wildlife. You're the reason why I do these things. So good night, everyone. I appreciate it.